20 million people, one coffin, and a war holding its breath. This week, the streets of Tehran are filling with what may become one of the largest funerals in human history. The man in the flag-draped casket ruled Iran for 36 years. He survived revolutions, sanctions, and uprisings. But on February 28, 2026, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's luck ran out in a storm of nearly 900 airstrikes that changed the Middle East forever. And now the peace talks that could end this war have stopped. For a funeral, this is the story of how we got here and what happens next. On July 4, 2026, Iran began a days-long state funeral for its slain Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who stood at the apex of the Islamic Republic since 1989. The ceremonies will run until July 9th, and Iranian authorities expect up to 20 million mourners to pass through Tehran. But this is more than a funeral. It is a pause button pressed on the most dangerous confrontation of the decade. The United States and Iran, at war since late February, have agreed to halt their peace negotiations for 1 week while Iran buries its leader. President Trump put it in his own characteristic way. He said he gave Iran a week off for the funeral because, quote, "we're nice." Behind the ceremony lies a nation in mourning, an economy in crisis, a successor in hiding, and a region balanced on a knife's edge. To understand this moment, we have to go back first to June 2025. That summer, Israel launched what became known as the 12-Day War, a sudden campaign of strikes against Iran's military and nuclear facilities. The United States joined, bombing 3 of Iran's most sensitive nuclear sites: the Fordow enrichment facility, buried deep inside a mountain, the sprawling complex at Natanz, and the research center at Isfahan. A ceasefire ended that war, but it settled nothing. For months afterward, Washington and Tehran circled each other through negotiations that repeatedly stalled. Then came February 28, 2026. In a single coordinated operation, American and Israeli forces launched nearly 900 strikes in just 12 hours, hitting Iranian missiles, air defenses, military infrastructure, and the leadership itself. Among the dead, the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, killed at the age of 86. Iran and its regional allies answered with war. Here's how the past 4 months unfolded. February 28th, the war begins. Iran retaliates with missile barrages, and the conflict spreads to Iran's regional allies. In March, fighting rages for over 5 weeks. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway carrying roughly 1/5 of the world's oil. Global energy markets convulse in what becomes the largest supply disruption in the history of the oil market. April 7th and 8th. After intense mediation, the United States and Iran agree to a ceasefire that includes Israel, but it strains almost immediately. Iran refuses to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, blaming continued Israeli attacks in Lebanon. On April 13th, President Trump responds with a naval blockade of Iran. The ceasefire holds, barely. Then in mid-June, a breakthrough. After the G7 summit, President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian sign a memorandum of understanding to end the war. Trump signing it remarkably during dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron at the Palace of Versailles. And on July 4th, with a final peace deal still under negotiation, Iran begins Khamenei's funeral. The talks pause. The world waits. The funeral itself is a display of state power on an extraordinary scale. Khamenei's flag-draped casket has been placed on public display in Tehran, and mourners are arriving from across the country. Qatari and Pakistani mediators, the diplomatic bridges between Washington and Tehran, say negotiations will resume at the earliest possible time, once the commemorations end on July 9th. But hovering over every image from Tehran is a question no one can answer. Where is the new Supreme Leader? Mojtaba Khamenei, the late Ayatollah's son and successor, has not been seen in public since taking power. Since the war began, he has communicated only through written statements. Never his face, never his voice. Analysts see two possibilities. Either Mojtaba is being shielded from the same fate as his father, or the succession itself is contested behind closed doors. Either way, the man who must ultimately approve any peace deal with America is a ghost. The numbers behind this war are staggering. Nearly 900 strikes in the first 12 hours alone. By mid-June, the war had cost American taxpayers an estimated $113 billion. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz triggered the largest oil supply disruption ever recorded, hitting natural gas, fertilizer, aviation, and tourism industries worldwide. And now, a funeral that could draw 20 million people, roughly 1 in every 4 Iranians, into the streets of Tehran. Khamenei ruled for 36 years. His successor has been publicly visible for 0 days. What does this pause really mean? Regional analysts point to 3 readings. First, the optimistic one. Both sides want this deal, and pausing for the funeral is a gesture of respect that costs Washington little and buys goodwill in Tehran. Second, the skeptical one. Iran's new leadership may be using the funeral to consolidate power before making concessions. 20 million mourners are also 20 million reminders of what the Islamic Republic can still summon. Third, the dangerous one. Hardliners in Tehran view the peace talks as capitulation to the powers that killed their leader. A funeral of this scale, charged with grief and anger, could harden Iran's position or fracture it entirely. When the mourning ends on July 9th, 3 questions will decide the region's future. Will the talks resume and produce a final treaty covering the nuclear program, the Strait of Hormuz, and sanctions relief? Will Mojtaba Khamenei finally appear, and can an unseen leader hold together a wounded, grieving nation? And can a ceasefire born at a dinner in Versailles survive contact with the streets of Tehran? The answers will shape oil prices, nuclear proliferation, and the balance of power in the Middle East for a generation. A supreme leader assassinated, a 4-month war that shook the global economy, a peace deal signed over dinner at a French palace, and now a funeral so vast it stopped diplomacy itself. Iran is burying more than a man this week. It may be burying an era without knowing what comes next. The world is watching Tehran, and Tehran is watching a coffin.